So this colonial neighborhood was built on the looting of the knowledge and the resources of the Arabic Muslim population of the Iberia when the genocides and the Crusades were happening, and then the looting of the Americas, indigenous people and their resources. And now, do you see that similarity when you are looking, doing your research about the migrant genocide that is happening now?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the historical continuities are there, and they're huge, right? And we see, for example, that in 2024, just on their way to Spain, this is one country out of 27 European countries, 10,000 people were killed on their way to Spain.
Hey everybody, this is Laith Marouf from Free Palestine TV, and we are in Madrid, the capital of the Spanish kingdom, and we are in Plaza de Colón. Before we continue with this report, I ask you to press the subscribe button on whatever social media platform you're watching this on, and to go to our website, freepalestine.video, to donate so we can continue bringing you this content. Today we're going to be talking about this city, its colonial history, and if you believe it or not, its Arabic history. This is the only European capital that is built by the Arabic people. There was nothing here before the Arabic Muslim people arrived, and in fact the name Madrid comes from the Arabic word for Majra, which means the path of a river. There was only one river in this very hot deserty area of the Iberian Peninsula. And so there's a lot to discover from this and understand as after we went to Al-Andalus and Al-Gharb Al-Andalus in what is now Portugal, that the history of Arabic and Muslim people and their ancestors all the way to the Canaanites is crucial to the formation of identity here, and you know, it is an identity that is now been colonized and has been stripped of this history. And this is why we have with us today a very special guest, Iker Suarez. Thank you very much for bringing us here. Iker is a researcher, PhD researcher that's specialized on the issues of migrant rights and the genocide of the migrants at the gates of Fortress Europe. Iker, maybe you can tell us, beginning with the Arabic history, Muslim history of Madrid, and you know, and why we're here in this colonial square that is named after Columbus, what you guys call him, Colón?
That's right, yeah. Right. Yes, so I mean, Madrid is born in the Middle Ages, founded by the Muslim sort of kingdoms and formations of that time as a border sort of town that allows for the surveillance of the different warring factions of the peninsula at that time between Christian kingdoms and Muslim kingdoms. And so essentially it's as an oversight of that sort of warring place, right? And then in one moment it gets taken up by the Christians, and eventually with the consolidation of the sort of reconquest, so-called reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula.
The crusade, basically.
The crusade, exactly. It was literally a crusade, like very much supported by the Pope as a crusade. It's taken by the Christians, and then it's made into the capital of the newly sort of consolidating nation state, Catholic nation state that would then go on to colonize the Americas. And so we're here because I think it's a very important place in Madrid. And the centrality of the statue of Columbus there just kind of shows the continued commitment of Spanish nationalism today, which in many places could be seen as, you know, a bit less fascist, a bit more progressive, blah, 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 to its history of colonialism, right? And certain things that are important and interesting about this plaza here, this square, is one that it's coupled with what they call the Gardens of Discovery, right? And right now they are fenced off because there's going to be a watching party for the Spain game in the World Cup tonight, which just shows you really how closely tied, folk, football, sports types of nationalism are linked to these very sort of deeply rooted symbols of colonialism and histories of colonialism. There's no repentance about it, right? This place, this square is as well a place where I would say it's the epicenter of Spanish nationalism worldwide. The main demonstrations of the right wing, of the nationalist Spanish right wing are here. So again, recovering all of that sort of heritage. And ultimately is kind of where like people come to like say, oh, well, this is our legacy, right? And this is how Spain contributed to, civilization, blah, 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 right? Where obviously they're obfuscating the role of Spain in initiating ultimately Western colonialism and imperialism and setting the basis for all of the different ramifications of that later.
In other places in the Kingdom of Spain that we visited, a lot of the regions still remember their Arabic and Muslim history. Mm-hmm. I wonder if people in Madrid here actually even know that basic idea that this was built by Arabs or Muslims, or the name, where it comes from. Is that like obscured completely?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a small niche of tourism that starts to recognize that, but for the most part it's completely erased from the history of Madrid. This is the seat of Spanish Christian power. And I'll give you here, I think, a good anecdote, which is, what is the patron saint of the Spanish nation? It's called Santiago, so in the north in Galicia, Santiago Matamoros. What does this mean, this last name that they put to Santiago? It literally means the person who kills the Moors, Matamoros.
Wow.
This is the patron saint of the Spanish nation, Christian nation, which means that Spanish nationalism is very much formulated in opposition to Islam, in opposition to the Muslims that ruled here in the Iberian Peninsula for over 800 years. So yeah, it's absolutely obfuscated.
We've went around what is now the Kingdom of Spain, and we haven't had the chance to ask anybody yet about this festival that is held in every village and town, where they reenact the crusade, and they go, I think it's called Moros Cristianos, where they knock on the doors in the village and search if they have Moors, Arabs, Muslims, and they're all dressed up and chasing to basically lynch Arabs and Muslims, reenacting that. Does this happen in Madrid?
No, I don't think it happens in Madrid so much. I think this is more like a folk sort of thing that happens more in smaller towns.
And why is it like that? It's hidden, this story, because we know about how, Black Peter in, I think it's Denmark, Belgium or so on, or Denmark, where they celebrate, put blackface on, and with Christmas. Or we know about the chocolates in Belgium that look like cut hands and cut feet of Congolese people. Everybody knows that about in the world, but nobody knows this, that there's a national holidays in these villages in the Kingdom of Spain where they reenact the lynching of Arabs and Muslims.
Yeah, no, I think there's something particular about the way in which Spanish whiteness relates to its own sort of identity. Because the thing is, here, from the north of Europe, like all of those countries that you cited in the north of Europe, the way they've looked upon Spain is as not white enough, right? As you mixed too much with these Muslims and these Jews and these Roma people, right? And so therefore you're not European enough. And so there's a particular sort of anxiety within Spanish identity, and I think self-presentation, that is, we have to delete that completely, otherwise they're gonna tell us we're Africans, right? Because as they said, up until the end of the dictatorship, which was up until the late 70s here in Spain, fascist dictatorship, they used to say, for example in France, they used to say, Africa starts below the Pyrenees. Africa starts below the mountains that divide France and Spain. And so there's this ambivalence here, and this anxiety that Spanish nationalism and whiteness has to deal with, and therefore has to really kind of cover and obfuscate all of that even more, right? Where the more secure whiteness of the Norwegians or of the Belgians does not need to do that. You see what I'm saying?
Perfect. Okay, so we're gonna walk now to another location that is
Yes.
important in the city, and we'll carry this conversation there.
Perfect.
So, Iker, where are we now?
So this is Calle Serrano, which is in the middle of Barrio de Salamanca, which is, I would say, the seat of the Spanish elite, of the Spanish bourgeoisie. This neighborhood was created in the 19th century to kind of be apart from the, the plebeians over on the classical Madrid. And all of the buildings you see here are very noble, are very kind of like, you can see the seat of this colonial wealth here, right? And so two things are interesting about this neighborhood. One of them is that nowadays is getting a lot of influx of rich Latin American elites, right? That are coming here because they want to be in the first world, but also they want to be away from like working class Spaniards, right? And so it's a neighborhood that is kind of, you can see cohering sort of these different transatlantic elites, right? In this neighborhood. That's one thing. The second thing that I think historically is really interesting is in Spain, we had a civil war between the fascists and the Republicans, among them a lot of socialists and anarchists. And Madrid was a seat of Republican power because it was the capital. The offensive of the fascists bombed Madrid a lot. What neighborhood did they not bomb? This neighborhood right here, because this again was the seat of the Spanish elite, and it was the allies and the people that actually favored the fascists, who were raided by the Germans, the Nazis, in that period to take the city. And so, it's a place that today continues to be kind of the seat of this power. It's a place where like normal people from Madrid like don't really come because it's just completely unaffordable, except to the park right over there, which we'll see in a second, right? And so right here we can see maybe what would be La Puerta de Alcalá, which is a kind of Enlightenment type, French type monument that is built by this king that was supposed to be the enlightened despot, which is supposed to be these monarchs that did not take the revolutionary road of the French, right, but that were doing social reforms, in this case capitalist reforms on the land, etc., etc. And that of course was still holding the colonial empire. That was an enslaver, that was a genocider, etc., right? And so this is one of those monuments that you can see there, Rege Carolo III, which is like the King Charles III and the year. So again, you see many things here that symbolize the seat of this power, how it's renovated, not just from the early days of Colón, but also then renovated in the 19th and 20th century.
So I like this idea of enlightened despot, or Israeli Democrat kind of situation. It's or liberal Zionist. These oxymoron contradictions that they put together, and we as human beings are supposed to deny logic and even accept the rape of language to create such terms. But that's it seems to be at the essence of colonialism, is this destruction of language and meaning, to force our thoughts to accept these realities that no human should be accepting. So this colonial neighborhood was built on the looting of the knowledge and the resources of the Arabic Muslim population of the Iberia when the genocides and the Crusades were happening, and then the looting of the Americas, indigenous people and their resources. So when we look at this right now, this reality, we try to connect it to our days today, thinking about the migrants that are trying to cross the Mediterranean to escape the killing fields in Africa and Asia that imperialism has instituted. And how do you compare those two stories? One, the genocides of the Americas, emptying them of indigenous people to extract their resources, but at that time the indigenous people didn't have a place to escape to. And now, do you see that similarity when you are looking, doing your research about the migrant genocide that is happening now?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the historical continuities are there, and they're huge, right? And we see, for example, that in 2024, just on their way to Spain, this is one country out of 27 European countries, 10,000 people were killed on their way to Spain. 10,000 people. This year, in the first 5 months, every 3 hours, one person is dying on their way to Spain. Every 3 hours, yeah? So in the course of this interview and when we met and everything, one person has already been murdered by Europe and by Spain, right? And so I think the continuities are many, because what used to happen in faraway lands, if you will, right, from here, what used to be kind of externalized is now coming home to roost, right? It's coming back to Europe, and Europe can no longer externalize it. It can no longer like keep it away, especially from its liberal publics. And this is the problem for them, right? They don't want their liberal publics to not think that they're like liberal. They don't want to think that they are enlightened despots. And so this is why they try to push it further down. For example, Spain has just signed, I think it's $500 million agreement with Mauritania. And so Mauritania is becoming the place of like detentions and migrant prisons that ultimately try to keep the problem contained there. And so to keep the sacrifice zone that you were mentioning over there.
So you're mentioning now Mauritania. Is that because now with the Libyan dictatorship that has been installed to kill indigenous people, African peoples trying to come to Europe and loot the resources of Libya, and or the Moroccan despot that is also blocking the migration? Is that because now people are going the Mauritania path to reach the islands that are controlled by Spain?
Yes, the Canary Islands, exactly. That's what happens. When you think about migrating north, it's almost like a battlefield. What does this mean? It means that migrants, people on the move, they search for ways to get to Europe. The thing is, whenever they find a way, Europe comes back and tries to close that way. And so when it tries to close it, people on the move find another way. And so it's almost like a battlefield, trying to move positions, trying to ultimately just find ways to get to Europe and lead a dignified life that imperialism doesn't let them live in their country of origin, right? And so Mauritania specifically is because of the charter access to the Canary Islands, because the Libyan route has not been closed, but it's really hard. The Moroccan, so the Western Mediterranean route has been nearly closed by the collaboration of the monarchy. And so people look for other ways. And I think one of the, not silver linings, but one of the things to take into account is that however much money and militarization they invest in this, people find a way, right? The agency of people from the south continues to find a way and defy the imperial hegemons that try to keep them out. Whatever they do, it keeps happening. And so this is ultimately one of the biggest defeats, I think, for the West.
Well, I think obviously time is running out for colonialism, and it's mainly thanks to the peoples that are resisting militarily and trying to defeat it.
That's right.
That's the only way you can stop a monster. You can't dialogue with a monster there. So a rapist, a cannibalist is going to eat you and rape you while you're talking to them. So this is a perfect moment for the progressive left that is now empowered by the resistance of the Axis in Western Asia and its military defeat of the United States and NATO and the Zionist Jewish colony, to actually take advantage and put forward a more radical positionality. Because up until now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the left in the imperial domains has abandoned all its radicalism and became very liberalized and just about talk. So how do you see these changes affecting the left? Do you see any with this militancy in Western Asia is affecting now the language? And do you view, do you have any recommendations for this left to change its tack and catch up to the times that we are living right now?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think, Al-Aqsa flood really sets in motion a new period of history. And I think as far as the Western left, the first thing that I would say is we always have to be wary of its relevance. Will it be relevant will it be a relevant actor in the world system, given all of the actors in the world system that are actually, for example, militant resistance in West Asia, right? Other actors pursuing sovereign development, et cetera, that are relevant. Will the left in the West rise to the challenge and be relevant, right? And so for that, this is not something that we can sort of take for granted. And the question you ask is, if you will, the question of the century for those of us who reside here and organize here. And I think, you know, some of the things that we have to do here is get ready for the fact that resistance in the South is leading the way for the decline of the arrangement that ultimately co-opted Northern working classes into a sort of a sense of comfort, of liberalism, of complicity, of conformism, right? Because the imperial arrangement is being challenged in the peripheries of the system by militant resistance, by sovereign development, by the interruption of the channels of wealth making of the West, we are in a better position, as you well said, to organize for the demise of that empire. In other words, it advances our struggle, right? So we ought to realize here in the West that those struggles, right, advance our own struggle. This is important because it is not just thinking about those struggle in moral terms. Colonialism is bad. It's a struggle that unites our interests, right? That sees the struggle of the different factions of the resistance axis in West Asia as united to the struggle of liberation of, you know, working classes or whatever you want to call it here in the West, right? And so I think this is important. As far as like what would be the recommendations, right? I think for us it's important to get ready for this demise. I think this crisis will intensify, and will intensify insofar as the South rises, right? And so for us, it is important to build the organizational capacity, so the ability to do stuff, you know, which goes well beyond like, you know, specificities of ideology and things like this, so that when the moment comes, we're ready to meet the task that history imposes upon us. And again, this is, you know, we can't take this for granted. We can't trust. You know, the record of the left of the Western left in the past many decades has been one of disappointment. So it is up to us to like face those problems and those challenges and try to build against them for what comes.
You know, I started this conversation with you talking about how other parts of the Spanish kingdom speak more about their heritage that is connected to Arabic and Muslim era and the Canaanite Phoenician era.
Yeah.
My other question is, there is a lot of radical revolutionary history, even very recent, when we mentioned the anti-fascist fight, the communist anarchist alliance, militias against the dictatorship.
Yes.
Is it possible right now for the communities of activists in the Kingdom of Spain to start reviving that heritage, not only in words or celebrations or what have you, but actually looking at it as a model to try to emulate again? Is that something you feel that is possibly going to come in the future?
I think it's in the making. I think it's something that we are working with, the recuperation of both symbols and practices. I think obviously we have to update some of those practices to our current context and understand that, you know, we can't just like copy them from, you know, the Republic, like the 1930s, right? Where some people in the 1930s in Spain said, oh, this kind of looks like Russia in 1905 or 1915 because of the class structure, the agrarian question, all of these things, right? We can't just, you know, feel too comfortable with copying those things into the present, but we have to recuperate that history and recuperate the militancy and recuperate ultimately, I think, our alignment and deep sort of class unity with the people of the South, because that's the only way really that we're gonna like be able to exact change. Because otherwise, I think personally, this is my personal take, like the people of the North are too easily co-optable, right? And so when you don't tie your struggle to the struggle of the peoples of the world for the liberation of all of them, and then also, you know, our own liberation from our own tyrants, then you're gonna end up in the same sort of pitfalls of, you know, falling back into, okay, we got a better minimum wage type situation, right? Which, as Ali Kadri says so often, right, is tied to shorter lives in the South, right? So anyway, I think that's kind of where we are, and the recuperation of those things is important.
So, on that point of current dictatorships, Spain government, the Spanish government, at least right now,
Yeah.
Pedro Sanchez, have a lot of rhetoric that is against genocide in Palestine or critical of the Jewish colony, but there's practically zero action taken. So let's talk about the complicity of the regime here in Spain with the genocide that is hidden from the view of the people of Spain and the world.
Yes, yes. So I would say Pedro Sanchez is a progressive sort of president. And what is interesting about him is that performatively, he creates some superficial fractures within the imperial bloc. And that's interesting, to say the least, yeah? It's not, nothing incredibly revolutionary or anything, but it has the capacity to sort of create fractures. However, as you very well say, the reality here is that it's completely complicit. One, it's raising military budgets within a NATO framework, so we know what NATO is. NATO is the axis of genocide, right? Secondly, when it recognized Palestine, I'm gonna say maybe 6 months or 1 year before the rest of the European countries, it did so 2 months before the European elections. In other words, it only did so to get votes, because social democracy marshals these things, instrumentalizes these things to try to ultimately stay in power, right? To stay in power and continue things as usual. That's one. Second, it imposed, shortly before the biggest protest for Palestine here, it imposed an arms embargo on Israel to try to pacify that protest, which he didn't, because we tore shit down here for a while. It was this cycling event where basically there was an Israeli team and everybody in Spain kind of boycotted it, and so they couldn't actually finish the cycling event. Whatever, some civil disobedience, not too big, but it was big in the context of the North, I think. And so he did this arms embargo, announced it everywhere, went on English speaking sort of speeches for the people to know, to position himself as, the paladin of progressiveness and whatnot. And then we realized shortly after that there was an exception to national security concerns to buy Israeli armament, and that in fact there had been more deals that had been going on, right? Then we had the other thing with the aggression on Iran, on the Islamic Republic, right? What happened there? Very early, Pedro Sanchez positioned himself as saying no to war, no a la guerra, right? And he said, and then shortly after, he said, we're not going to allow the U.S. bases in Spanish territory to be used for the deployment of, air supplies or whatever military endeavors it is that they needed to do. Shortly after, it was proved that more than 40 flights had gone through those bases, that in fact it had not been cut. And so this just continues. And I'll just mention two more things. Pedro Sanchez, the paladin of progressivism, is completely agreeing with the sanctions against Iran, which we know is a more deadly mechanism than kinetic war, right? 500,000 people a year die from Western sanctions. Completely okay with that. And secondly, he continues to criminalize resistance with the tag of terrorists, right? The terrorist label. And recently, I mean, you guys know this, how they've been upping repression against people who are adjacent to resistance factions in West Asia, right? So I would say that really it's a delicate dance between kind of being this progressive figure and then also continuing to enforce the hard basis of what imperialism is, right? So I will say no to war, I will recognize Palestine, I will say genocide is bad, but then also I will sanction you, I will jail the resistance, and ultimately I will, help in the military effort of the Zionist entity and the colony, right? So I think that's kind of the dance, right? And another example, for example, is, I just recently learned about it, the Western Sahara, right? Which is an occupied territory per the UN. Its airspace is actually controlled by Spain because it used to be a Spanish
protectorate.
A Spanish protectorate, right? But it continues to be the airspace continues to be controlled by Spain, and so all of the attacks against resistance factions there, against the occupation of the Sahara, are done with the consent of ultimately the Spanish military and therefore the Spanish progressive government. So there's just many ways in which this delicate dance is kept. And the thing is, for people that are not informed enough, it's a shame because people see it and especially see it from the outside, and they're like, oh, this is my man, you know, this is he's actually standing up for things. But for people that are in here, that are in the movement, that are fighting against Zionism and imperialism, we ought to keep the pressure against this hypocrisy.
So up until now, the public pressure, and we know 78% of citizens of the Kingdom of Spain are for the liberation of Palestine and against the genocide committed by the Jewish colony. So up until now, the pressure of this population was able to force a change in the discourse or language that the government of Spain is using, but hasn't been successful in causing a change in the behavior of this government. What do you think should be done by the masses in Spain to force the government to actually implement the will of the people in terms of the genocide in Palestine?
It's a good question, Laith. I mean, I think you know, the main jail and trap of the movements that we have in the north, and the pro-Palestine movement as well, is the fact that we continue to be tied to performative ways of expression. Ultimately, the demonstration, right? The march. And the march is okay, but the march actually doesn't exert that much pressure, right? And so there's certain initiatives that actually kind of like, as some people would say, throw sand in the gears, right? Throw things into the gears of the mechanism that actually disturb the normal functioning of things, and therefore do become a something to be dealt with by the government. Because the government, you know, at the end of the day, in my opinion, you know, humble opinion, I don't think the government's language has changed necessarily only because of the demonstrations. I think it has changed because Pedro Sanchez is a very self-interested person that knows how to position himself in the media in an international context to be this sort of figure of progressivism, right? And so just a couple months ago, he did this like, you know, left-wing progressive international meeting in Barcelona with Lula, with Gustavo Petro, with all of these people, and he likes that figure, right? And so for him, it's not costly at all to do some of the things. And so I think for us is to move from the things that are just expressive to things that actually are disruptive in a way that is, you know, that is felt, that he gets a call, you know? He has to get a call saying this happened, or this is happening, and this is a problem, right? Because he's not getting calls about the demonstrations, I can tell you that.
No.
You know?
Well, clearly behavior change for elites usually needs to hit their bodies and their pockets in different ways.
That's
their
right.
Structures of control.
That's right.
And as we see it from the outside, as revolutionaries from our region, we haven't yet seen true revolutionary actions. No. We may think about Palestine Action, let's say in the UK, was going in that path. But unfortunately, they still were stuck in that dichotomy of performance and wanted to film themselves, thinking that releasing those social media videos will change something. In fact, it just entrapped them, and now they are going to jail for a long time. We wish them freedom, but for anyone that wants to take militant action in the imperial core, they need to forget social media as a battlefield and concentrate on taking down these factories or these bases, not filming themselves, not pronouncing it, not announcing it, not posting anything, and let the enemy, the imperialists, be the ones that cover it in their media. Iker Suarez, thank you so much for your time. I ask everybody to research his work, read more of the things that he published. Great work, great work. And one more time, go to our website, freepalestine.video, to donate, and press the subscribe and on whatever social media platform you're watching on. Until we see you next time, we bid you all a world free of imperialism, Zionism, and colonialism.